Hey everyone, Rob Bertholf here again with the next module in the Theism course in the Theological track, and this one's titled Pathway to God. And I think it's interesting because on the surface level, there's the way we present what religion is to us, and if we can define a personal God and things like this, becomes very nuanced. And so I want to approach this one where we say, what if I were to, be asked, or what if I were to say that I have a personal path to God? What if, some people are going to be thinking about, the response is like, well, I don't fit into any one religion, and I believe that, I'm on my own path to find truth. And this, I believe, is a rejection of standardized religions, which most of them are horrible objectively. We've seen how many religious bodies have imposed their will on others collectively. We've seen how many religious bodies are ultimately, there's a lot of problems with religion, but because there's a lot of problems with man, and anytime man groups together. And so I think what's come out from this is that there ends up being people that say, I'm on a personal path to God. I have my own way that I worship God, and initially this seems logical to me, and I'm like, oh, that's wonderful. I'm glad that you're on a path, right? This ties into, though, the last module we're talking about, which is objective versus subjective truth. And so what I'm curious about exploring is, what if the God that you say that you worship, that you're on your own personal path to worship, has given specific instructions on how they want to be worshipped? Right? And so it's interesting just to think about the idea that if there is an objective truth, and if God has said, this is how I want to be worshipped, and then we end up worshiping in our own quote-unquote personal path, does that ultimately work outside of the alignment of what God has asked? Do we think that this pleases God if we choose our own way to worship God outside of how God has asked? Now, from a Christian, monotheistic and Christian perspective, God has been very clear with how he wants to be worshipped. And so I just think it's very interesting about, thinking through at least, are we learning about who God is, or are we taking it on ourselves to define who we want God to be, right? Ultimately, I would ask us to really think about, in our state, in our path, are we discovering God or inventing God? Because I think there's a difference. If we're discovering God, right, that's a path that we can take, and as we learn more information, we align ourselves around what God has asked, as we don't necessarily have to know everything when we first start. But ultimately, if we know in the back of our mind what God has asked, and then we decide to go outside of that and form our own path, that ultimately is inventing who we want God to be, or placing ourselves as God. Now, from if you've read the story in Genesis about Cain and Abel, it's interesting to wonder, are we defining how we want to worship God, similar to how Cain decided how he wanted to worship? In the story, God had made very clear instructions that we're to, during this sacrificial system that was pointing forward towards Jesus, there was this metaphorical sacrificial system that was happening, where they would kill a lamb and offer that to God, a spotless lamb that pointed forward to Jesus. And Cain said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to kill my flock, but I have some fruit. And I'm going to give God fruit on my altar instead. And God did not acknowledge that fruit. He didn't consume it with fire like he did with Cain, with Abel. And so this actually ended up creating the foundation for the world's first murder, right? So the first murder from a biblical narrative came from Cain defining how he wanted to worship God, and then in rejection of his gift, and took it out on his brother. So I would just kind of, question things about, what about the day of worship? Like, if we believe in the Bible, and it makes it very clear that we are to worship on the seventh day, and yet the tradition of man which came from the Catholic Church, even and it never was shaken through the Protestant Reformation, is to worship on the first day. Would that make us modern day Cains if we were to choose to worship how we wanted versus how God specifically asked us to? So it's just something I'll leave you with. But I think we must acknowledge that our ways need to align with God's, otherwise we are in rebellion, right? We read in 1 Corinthians 13:12 that we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face, now I know in part, but then shall I know, even though as I am known. Ultimately, we see through a clouded lens. The more we seek to understand God, the more we'll understand objective truth and see His light. There will be a time where we will see God as He is and will fully understand His objective reality. We're told in 1 John 3:2 that we will see Him as He is. And the Bible tells us that we are to study and to think for ourselves and not just take, what people tell us, not take what I tell you, but we're to do our own research and to come to our own conclusions. And my hope is that I'm able to give you enough terms and concepts to inspire the right questions, as it's hard to know what questions to ask without, enough data to even know kind of how to pose those. And so ultimately, if we believe there's a God, how do we determine which theism or even which religion is accurate, as there's so many different religions out there? And this is what this course in theism is really all about, which is how do we treat religion as a science, right? What can we pull from? Is it world history, which is very critical to understanding religion? Without understanding world history, you'll never understand religion. You'll never understand God without understanding how things have played out, right? Can we look at mathematics and physical science and biology, as well as the demonstrable aspects of physics, and ultimately, how do we use common sense to look at religion as a science? And so this is the intro really to the next module, which I'm excited to really present. And for me, I've found that the only way to truly understand and also defend what I believe is by treating religion not as an art form, as a science. And ultimately that then takes us back to this idea that if it's a science, there is not a subjective path to God. And I'll hopefully be able to share in this series that there is an objective path to how God wishes and is asked to be worshipped.